A quiet afternoon in a small-town park turned cruel in seconds. A group of privileged young men surrounded an elderly woman in a wheelchair, laughing as they pushed her back and forth, recording her fear like it was entertainment. Her old dog stepped in front of her, trembling but brave. One kick sent him collapsing onto the pavement. "Please," she cried. "He's all I have." Then everything stopped. A deep growl cut through the air. A German shepherd stood rigid, eyes locked, trained and unafraid. Behind him, silent, steady, a former Navy SEAL stepped forward. "Touch them again," he said calmly, "and this ends very differently." Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Subscribe and stay until the end, because what happens next changes everything. The late afternoon hung heavy over the small-town park, warm air, unmoving clouds, low and colorless, as if the sky itself were waiting for something it refused to name. The park had once been a place of quiet pride. Not beautiful, but familiar. Cracked stone paths curved through trimmed grass benches, lined with chipped green paint, faced a dry fountain, and a few stunted trees offered narrow strips of shade. People still came out of habit, parents killing time, retirees feeding pigeons, teenagers drifting in loose clusters, but the place no longer felt like it belonged to anyone. Near the eastern walkway sat Eleanor Whitman, an elderly woman in a wheelchair positioned carefully beside the path. She was 78 years old, slight in build, her body narrowed by age and illness rather than choice. Her shoulders sloped forward as if apologizing for taking up space. Thin silver hair was gathered into a loose bun at the nape of her neck, wisps escaping to frame a face etched with years of restraint and quiet endurance. Her skin was pale and fragile-looking, mapped with fine wrinkles and age spots. Her hands small and unsteady where they rested on the armrests. Eleanor had once been a librarian at the town's middle school. For decades, she had spoken softly, corrected, gently, believed firmly in rules and patience. 3 years earlier, a stroke had taken her left side strength and much of her independence. Since then, she had learned to plan every outing carefully, how long she could sit where she could rest, which routes were smooth enough for her chair. She had learned, too, to keep her eyes down and her voice calm. At her feet stood Biscuit, her dog. Biscuit was a golden retriever, nearly 12 years old, his once thick golden coat now faded and thin, especially around the hips and belly. His muzzle was white with age, his eyes a soft, watery brown that still followed Eleanor with unwavering devotion. One ear drooped permanently, the result of an infection years ago that never fully healed. His movements were slow, stiff with arthritis, but he stayed close, always close, as if distance itself were dangerous. The two of them had been making their slow way through the park when the laughter began. 4 young men stepped into Eleanor's path, spreading out just enough to block her forward movement. They were clean, confident, and unmistakably out of place among the worn benches and quiet regulars. Their clothes were new, their shoes spotless, their watches heavy on their wrists. They carried themselves with the ease of people who had never been told no in any way that mattered. The one in front was Logan Pierce. Logan was tall and athletic, his posture relaxed to the point of arrogance. His blonde hair was styled carefully, not a strand out of place, and his face held the smooth symmetry of someone who had always been admired. His smile came easily, but lacked warmth, more a reflex than an emotion. He had grown up hearing his last name spoken with deference, watching adults change tone mid-sentence. It had taught him that consequences were flexible things. Logan raised his phone, angling the camera toward Eleanor. "Well, look at this," he said, his voice loud enough to draw attention. "You lost, Grandma." Eleanor felt her chest tighten. Her fingers curled against the armrests. "I'm just passing through," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "Please move." The others laughed. To Logan's left stood Tyler Knox, shorter but broader, with a shaved head and a thick neck that seemed permanently tense. His arms were crossed over his chest muscles, pressing against the fabric of his hoodie. Tyler had the restless energy of someone who enjoyed intimidation for its own sake. He shifted his weight and nudged the wheelchair lightly with his foot, testing. "Careful," he said, smirking. "These things tip easy." Eleanor gasped as the chair jerked sideways. Panic flared, sharp and immediate, overriding years of practiced calm. Her heart raced, and for a moment she couldn't draw a full breath. Biscuit moved instinctively. He stepped forward, placing his aging body between Eleanor and the young men. His legs trembled, but he held his ground. A low bark escaped him, not aggressive, not threatening, but desperate. The sound of a dog who remembered what it meant to protect, even if his body no longer fully could. That was when Tyler kicked him. It wasn't a wild strike. It didn't need to be. Tyler lifted his foot and drove it into Biscuit's side with casual precision, as if swatting away an inconvenience. The impact sent Biscuit collapsing onto the pavement. He cried out a sharp, broken yelp and tried to stand, failed, and lay shaking. Eleanor screamed. The sound tore from her throat before she could stop it. Years of careful quiet shattered in an instant. "No." "Please," she cried, leaning forward in her chair, one hand clawing uselessly at the air. "Don't hurt him, please. He's all I have." Her words echoed briefly in the open space, then fell flat. Around them, the park had gone silent. A young mother turned her face away and pretended to check her phone, pulling her child closer with her free hand. An older man stiffened on a bench, his jaw tightening as his gaze dropped to the ground. A pair of teenagers slowed, watched, then quickly looked elsewhere, their shoulders hunched, as if shrinking could make them invisible. No one stepped forward. Logan laughed the soundlight and unbothered. He circled slowly, keeping the camera trained on Eleanor's face, capturing her tears, her trembling mouth. "Oh my God," he said. "She's crying. This is unreal." One of the others muttered something about views and likes. Another snorted. Eleanor's hands shook violently now. She tried to reach Biscuit again, but her arm wouldn't obey, falling uselessly back to her lap. Her mind raced memories of order and fairness clashing painfully with the reality before her. She had believed in rules her whole life, in decency, in people doing the right thing when it mattered. Biscuit whimpered softly, his breath-shallow eyes still locked on Eleanor despite the pain. He tried to crawl toward her, dragging his front paws weakly against the pavement. "Stop," Eleanor begged. "Please stop." No one answered her. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. It pressed down on Eleanor's chest, heavier than the laughter, heavier than the pain in her dog's body. It told her something she had tried not to believe since the stroke, since her husband's death, since the world had begun to feel smaller and sharper. That she was alone. And in that moment, the silence of the crowd became as terrifying as the cruelty itself. And it was that silence that waited for someone to break it. He emerged from the shaded path where the trees grew close together, their leaves filtering the light into narrow bands of green and gray. The sound of laughter reached him, first sharp and careless, followed by a woman's thin, breaking voice. The man slowed instinctively, as if stepping into a space already charged with danger. His name was Daniel Hale. Daniel was 42, tall and broad-shouldered, with the solid build of someone who had carried weight for most of his adult life. His posture was straight, but not rigid, the stance of a man who had learned to stay ready without appearing threatening. Dark hair cut short out of long habit was threaded with early gray at the temples. A trimmed beard outlined a face of strong angles and restraint, and a faint scar traced along his jaw, old healed but never forgotten. His eyes were dark and alert, carrying the fatigue of too many nights, broken by memories he never talked about. Beside him walked Rex, a German Shepherd, K9. Rex was 9 years old, large even for his breed, with a powerful chest and long, disciplined limbs. His black and tan coat was dense and clean, though time had begun to frost his muzzle with gray. His ears stood erect, swiveling subtly as he assessed the scene ahead. Years of military training had shaped him into a study in control, no wasted movement, no unnecessary sound. The faint scars hidden beneath his fur told their own quiet story. Rex did not pull at the leash. He did not bark. He simply walked at Daniel's side, matching his pace exactly. They stopped at the edge of the clearing. Daniel took in the scene. In a single glance, the elderly woman in the wheelchair hunched and trembling. The old dog collapsed on the pavement, breathing shallowly. The young men standing too close, laughing too easily. His chest tightened, not with rage, but with recognition. He had seen this before in different uniforms, in different places. Power testing its limits, silence allowing it. Rex saw it too. The dog's body stiffened, almost imperceptibly. His head lowered a fraction, eyes locking onto the group of young men. A low growl vibrated in his chest, controlled and steady, a warning rather than a threat. It was the sound of training meeting instinct. The laughter faltered. Logan Pierce was the first to notice them. His phone dipped slightly as his gaze lifted, scanning Daniel, then dropping to Rex. The easy grin on his face hesitated, as if unsure whether to remain. "Well," Logan said slowly, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land. "What's this?" Tyler Knox shifted his weight, frowning. His earlier confidence wavered as his eyes tracked the German Shepherd's size, the way the dog's attention never left them. Tyler's foot, which had been casually planted near the fallen dog, pulled back an inch. Daniel didn't rush forward. He didn't shout. He stood exactly where he was allowing his presence to speak before his words did. He felt Rex's quiet tension through the leash, the dog waiting not for permission, but for purpose. Daniel's gaze moved deliberately from Logan's face to the woman in the wheelchair. Up close, he could see how small she was, how her hands shook as they hovered uselessly above her lap. He noticed the way her eyes kept flicking between her injured dog and the young men, as if trying to decide which fear was greater. The sound of her breathing, quick, shallow, reached him clearly now. Something old and familiar stirred in Daniel's chest. He spoke. "Step back." His voice was low, calm, almost quiet enough to be mistaken for indifference. But there was weight behind it, the kind that came from certainty rather than volume. For a moment, no one moved. The park seemed to hold its breath. Logan tilted his head, studying Daniel more carefully now. "You talking to us?" he asked, a hint of irritation creeping into his tone. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He took a single step forward, not aggressive, not hurried, placing himself closer to the woman and her dog. Rex followed without being told, moving in perfect sync, positioning his body subtly between the group and Eleanor. The German Shepherd's stance was unmistakable, protective, controlled, ready. Rex's growl deepened just slightly. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The sound carried intent. Logan swallowed and masked it with a smirk. "Relax." We're just messing around." Daniel finally looked at him. "I said step back," Daniel repeated. There was no anger in his eyes, no challenge, just resolve. The kind that didn't ask for permission or approval. The kind that didn't care who someone's family was. Around them, the bystanders shifted. A few people leaned forward without realizing it. Others straightened, as if suddenly aware of their own posture. The silence that had once protected cruelty now pressed in from another direction. Eleanor felt it too. For the first time since the men had surrounded her, the weight on her chest loosened slightly. She didn't know who this man was or why he had chosen to stop, but she felt the change in the air. It was subtle, fragile, but real. Rex stood perfectly still, eyes fixed, muscles coiled beneath his fur. He did not bare his teeth. He did not lunge. His control was more unsettling than aggression ever could be. Logan laughed again, softer this time, uncertain. "You some kind of hero?" he asked. Daniel's gaze never left him. "No," he said quietly. "I'm just not looking away." The words landed without force, but they landed all the same. The laughter did not return. In that suspended moment, something shifted an invisible line, drawn not with shouting or violence, but with presence. Instinct stirred ancient and unspoken. The instinct to protect. The instinct to stand between harm and the vulnerable. It rose in the man. It rose in the dog, and for the first time since the afternoon had begun, the cruelty no longer filled the space alone. Logan Pierce recovered first. He straightened his shoulders and let a familiar arrogance settle back into place, as if confidence were a jacket he could shrug on whenever needed. Up close, the sharpness of his features became clearer, clean jawline, straight nose, pale blue eyes that reflected calculation more than emotion. He had the look of a man who had never learned restraint, because restraint had never been required of him. "You're making a mistake," Logan said, voice smooth again. "You don't know who my family is." Daniel Hale did not respond immediately. He remained still, feet planted, shoulders relaxed, as though he had all the time in the world. He had learned long ago that silence unsettled people who relied on noise to feel powerful. His eyes stayed on Logan's face, not hostile, not impressed, simply attentive. Logan took a step closer, lowering his voice as if offering a courtesy. "My father makes one call and people disappear from towns like this. Jobs vanish. Leases get canceled. You don't want that." The threat was practiced. It had worked before. Daniel heard it without reacting. His mind drifted briefly to a different place, sand under boots, radio static, the moment when fear had been real and immediate, and money had meant nothing. Compared to that, this was small, predictable. Rex sensed the shift before anyone else. The German shepherd's stance tightened muscles, hardening beneath his coat. He didn't move forward, but his focus sharpened, eyes tracking Logan's hands, his weight distribution, the angle of his shoulders. Rex had been trained to read danger in increments, to recognize when words might turn into action. Logan noticed. "Control your dog," he snapped. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "He's fine," he said. "You're the one getting nervous." A flicker of anger crossed Logan's face. He gestured sharply, and one of the other young men stepped forward. Mark Ellison was thinner than the rest, mid-20s, with dark hair that fell into his eyes and a face that suggested discomfort more than cruelty. He wore expensive clothes like armor that didn't quite fit. Mark hesitated, glancing between Daniel and Rex, uncertainty written clearly across his expression. He wasn't used to confrontation without an audience cheering him on. "Logan," Mark muttered. Maybe we should. Logan cut him off with a glance. Relax. He turned back to Daniel. You think you're brave? Logan asked. Standing here playing hero, Daniel shook his head once. No. That answer seemed to confuse Logan more than defiance would have. I think you're used to people stepping aside. Daniel continued. You think that's fear. It's not. It's inconvenience. Logan laughed sharply. You really don't get it. Daniel met his gaze steady and unblinking. I do. The air felt tight now, charged. Bystanders had drifted closer, drawn by the tension despite themselves. Among them was Sarah Whitfield, a woman in her mid-30s, tall and slender, with dark auburn hair pulled into a low ponytail. She wore running clothes, earbuds hanging loose around her neck, her lightly freckled skin pale with concern. Sarah had stopped mid-jog breath, still uneven eyes fixed on the confrontation. She had lived in the town all her life and recognized Logan instantly. Fear warred with something else in her expression, shame perhaps. Eleanor watched from her wheelchair, heart pounding. She clutched the armrest torn between gratitude and dread. She had seen men like Logan before. She knew how quickly this could turn worse. She didn't want this stranger to suffer consequences because of her. Please, she whispered. You don't have to. Daniel didn't look back at her, but his voice softened. It's okay, Logan scoffed. You hear that? He gestured broadly. She doesn't even want your help. Daniel's jaw tightened, just slightly. People don't always ask for help when they need it. Rex shifted his weight claws, scraping faintly against the pavement. His ears were forward now, body angled, prepared. He was not aggressive, but the promise of action sat just beneath the surface, unmistakable. Logan's bravado began to fracture. He glanced around again, searching for laughter, for reinforcement. He found none. Only faces watching, remembering. You think this ends here? Logan asked. You think walking away makes you untouchable? Daniel stepped half a pace forward, not into Logan's space, but close enough to make the distance feel intentional. I think you're afraid, Daniel said quietly, and you don't know what to do with that. The words landed harder than a shove. For the first time, Logan looked unsure. The power he had leaned on, names, money, implication, had failed to move the man in front of him. Worse, it had been seen for what it was. Rex stood perfectly still, eyes locked, body ready. Fear, raw and unfamiliar, flickered across Logan's face. And in that moment, the balance shifted. Daniel did not leave town the next morning. He rented a small room above a hardware store on Main Street, the kind of place that smelled faintly of dust and old wood. The bed creaked when he sat on it, and the window looked out over a narrow alley where delivery trucks idled too long. It suited him. Anonymous. Temporary. The sort of place you stayed when you weren't sure how long you'd be needed. Rex lay on the floor beside the bed, head on his paws, eyes open. The German Shepherd was calm but attentive, tracking every sound from the street below. At 9 years old, Rex no longer slept as deeply as he once had. Experience had taught him that quiet places often hid important things. Daniel spent the morning walking, not searching, not confronting, just moving through the town at an unremarkable pace, letting himself be seen. He stopped at the grocery store, the post office, the diner by the park. Rex walked beside him, leash loose, presence steady. People noticed. Some stiffened. Some looked away. A few watched with open curiosity. By afternoon, Eleanor Whitman and asked him to sit with her. She lived in a small, aging house on a side street where the paint peeled in wide flakes and the porch sagged slightly on one corner. Inside, the air smelled of tea and old paper. Eleanor sat in her wheelchair by the window, sunlight falling across her lap. She looked smaller here, stripped of the public space that had amplified her fear the day before. Up close, Daniel noticed how carefully she chose her words, how often she paused to steady herself before speaking. It was not weakness. It was habit learned, after years of being ignored. "I wasn't the first," Eleanor said quietly. "Just the easiest." She told him about neighbors who had moved suddenly, leaving furniture behind. About a shop owner whose lease wasn't renewed after he refused to sell. About a man who lost his job after filing a complaint that went nowhere. Eleanor's voice trembled as she spoke, not from fear now, but from the effort of remembering things she had trained herself not to think about. Rex lay at her feet, careful not to crowd Biscuit, who rested nearby with a bandage wrapped gently around his ribs. The old golden retriever watched Rex with tired curiosity, his tail giving a faint thump against the floor. Rex acknowledged him with a slow blink, respectful, measured. Later that day, Daniel listened to others. Sarah Whitfield found him near the library, pacing the sidewalk as if rehearsing something she wasn't sure she would say. In daylight, she looked more fragile than she had in the park. Tall and slender, her long auburn hair hung loose around her shoulders, and faint freckles dotted her pale skin. She worked as a physical therapist at the local clinic, a profession that had taught her patience and restraint. It had also taught her how much damage silence could do. "My brother lost his job," she said finally. "Construction. One day they told him not to come back. No explanation." Her hands twisted together as she spoke. He'd argued with the wrong people. Daniel didn't interrupt. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, listening. Rex sat at his heel, eyes scanning posture, relaxed. Others followed. A mechanic with oil-stained hands who spoke in fragments. A waitress who kept her voice low and her eyes on the door. An older man who shook as he talked, anger and fear battling in equal measure. None of them asked Daniel to fix anything. They didn't ask him to confront anyone. They just talked. And Daniel listened. He didn't take notes. He didn't record names. He carried the stories the way he had once carried mission details, quietly, carefully, without judgment. Word spread. By the third day, people no longer avoided him. They nodded when he passed. Some stopped him outright. Others waited until evening, when the streets were quieter, and spoke quickly, as if afraid courage might evaporate if they paused too long. Rex became a familiar sight. Children asked if they could pet him. He allowed it, patiently lowering himself to their height, tail wagging once or twice in reserved approval. Adults watched him with a different kind of respect. A trained dog meant discipline. It meant boundaries. Daniel never threatened anyone. He never raised his voice. He didn't mention Logan Pierce or his family. He simply remained present, visible, unafraid. That, more than anything, unsettled the town's unspoken order. One evening, as Daniel walked Rex back toward the hardware store, he noticed curtains shifting along Main Street. Not fear this time. Attention. People were watching, not to avoid him, but to see what might happen next. At the corner, Eleanor waited with Biscuit bundled against the cooling air. Her face was tired, but determined. "They're talking," she said softly. "People I haven't heard speak in years." Daniel nodded. "That's how it starts." Rex sat beside them, steady as stone. The town did not change all at once. There were no confessions, no sudden apologies. Just something quieter and more dangerous to those who relied on control, the truth beginning to surface, one voice at a time. The shift did not announce itself with sirens or speeches. It began quietly, the way most irreversible things do. On a gray morning, heavy with coastal fog, Daniel noticed cars parked outside Eleanor Whitman's house that did not belong to her street. They were ordinary vehicles, sedans, an old pickup, a delivery van, but the people stepping out did not move with haste. They lingered, hesitated, adjusted coats, checked phones. Then they walked up to the porch, one by one. Eleanor watched from the window, hands folded tightly in her lap. Her silver hair was brushed neatly back, revealing the thin scars near her temple, left by a fall years earlier. She had once been a schoolteacher, firm but gentle, the kind who corrected without humiliating. Years of being dismissed had softened her voice, but not her spine. "They're early," she murmured. Daniel stood beside her, shoulders squared but relaxed. He had shaved that morning, the sharp angles of his face, more visible now, high cheekbones, a jaw set by years of discipline. War had carved restraint into him. Loss had carved patience. He did not reach for the door first. Rex rose quietly, moving to Eleanor's side. The German shepherd's coat had begun to gray around the muzzle, but his posture remained proud. His ears angled forward, alert but calm. He did not bark. He never barked unless told. The first knock was gentle. Sarah Whitfield stood outside, hands clasped around a folder pressed to her chest. In daylight, the tension in her posture was more visible. She was tall and slender, with auburn hair pulled into a loose braid and pale skin marked by faint freckles. Her eyes carried the fatigue of someone who listened to pain for a living and rarely spoke of her own. "I brought copies," she said softly, "just in case." Behind her stood Thomas Reed, the mechanic, broad-shouldered, with oil permanently stained into the creases of his hands. His beard was thick and uneven, the result of neglect rather than style. He nodded once at Daniel, not friendly, not hostile, just acknowledgement. More followed. Mrs. Alvarez from the bakery, her apron folded carefully over one arm. A young man Daniel had seen sweeping the library steps late at night. A couple who did not give their names at first, only their stories. They did not come to confront anyone. They came to be counted. By noon, Eleanor's living room was full. The air grew warm with bodies and voices. Biscuit lay on a folded blanket near the couch, his breathing steadier now, eyes half closed in contentment. Rex positioned himself near the doorway, not blocking it, simply present. A sentinel without spectacle. Daniel listened. People spoke haltingly at first, as if waiting for interruption that never came. Stories overlapped, then aligned. Patterns emerged. Complaints that vanished. Permits delayed. Inspections timed like punishments. The same names surfaced again and again, circling back to the same families, the same influence. No one raised their voice. No one had to. Outside, the town seemed unchanged. Cars passed. A lawnmower started somewhere down the street. But inside that small house, something fundamental had shifted. Fear, once private, had become shared, and shared fear, Daniel knew, lost its sharpest edge. Late in the afternoon, a man Daniel did not recognize stood near the doorway, unsure whether to enter. He was in his early 40s, lean with dark hair beginning to thin at the temples. His suit was worn but clean, his posture cautious. "My name's Michael Kerr," he said. "I used to work at the zoning office." Silence followed, not suspicion, but attention. Michael's voice trembled as he spoke. He described documents, altered signatures, forged files, reassigned. He had left quietly years ago, convinced no one would believe him. Speaking now felt like stepping onto ice that might still crack. Daniel met his eyes. "You're not alone." Michael swallowed and nodded. By evening, the fog had lifted. The group dispersed gradually, exchanging numbers, tentative smiles, replacing guarded expressions. Eleanor remained seated, exhaustion softening her features. She looked smaller again, but lighter. "I thought I'd die before this happened," she said, "before anyone listened." Daniel shook his head. "You waited. That's not the same thing." Rex settled beside Daniel as the house grew quiet. Biscuit shifted in his sleep tail, thumping once against the floor. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. Daniel sat on the porch steps as night settled in the familiar weight of Rex's presence, grounding him. War had taught him how to survive. This town, these people were teaching him something else. How to stay. Sometimes miracles do not come with thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes they arrive quietly through a stranger who refuses to look away, through a heart that chooses courage over comfort, through a moment when fear is replaced by compassion. Perhaps God does not always stop cruelty before it happens, but He gives ordinary people the chance to stand up when it does. And when even one person listens, protects, and refuses to be silent, something holy begins to move. In our daily lives, we may never face crowds or headlines, but we all meet moments where someone is ignored, bullied, or left alone. What we choose to do in those moments matters more than we know. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from or what this story meant to you. Subscribe to the channel so more stories of courage, faith, and humanity can be told. May God bless you and your loved ones. May He protect the elderly, comfort the forgotten, and strengthen those who speak for the voiceless. And may He remind us all that kindness, when chosen bravely, is its own miracle.